Well, I'll be honest with you. I don't know so much that she did herself when she was younger. I pretty much just told her you can't quit.
Sure.
So that was because I know from a professional, someone who's, specialist in the area of executive function, there's lots of research that shows how playing an instrument is actually one of the really great ways to train our executive function system for the
Mhm.
reasons I just explained, that it forces us to keep going even though we can't quite see the payoff. And that is an important cognitive developmental skill.
Welcome to the Time to Practice podcast. This is a space where we talk about music practice, the ups and downs that young musicians go through related to practice and learning music, and how we as parents, caregivers, and music educators can support the young musicians in our lives, support ourselves, and support each other. My name is Christine Goodner. I'm a music educator, author, and podcaster who has made it my mission to talk about music practice and to support educators and families looking to make home practice more effective and to reduce conflict and frustration in the practice room. I'm glad you're here. This episode is brought to you by my books for families of music students. First, Beyond the Music Lesson, which is for those who are just getting started or who want to go back to basics and reset things a bit at the start of the year. Positive Practice, which is a workbook for problem solving music practice, especially pain points for young students. And then Music Practice Makeover, which is meant for those who have been into music lessons for a while and have been practicing for a while and are looking for further strategies beyond the beginning phases and to help families understand more about what makes practice work for their individual child. You can find my books at bookshop.org, barnesandnoble.com, amazon.com, or through my website, suzukitriangle.com/books. Thanks for supporting the work of this podcast anytime you purchase my materials. You're listening to episode 112. This week, we are kicking off the new year with a great conversation with someone whose work has had a huge influence on me, both in understanding the needs of students I work with, not to mention myself. If you've ever thought when working with your own child in practice or with your students in lessons, there's something going on here that's about more than music, then this episode is for you. All right. Well, welcome everyone. I'm delighted today to be joined by Tera Sumpter, who is a speech language pathologist who specializes in reading, executive functioning skills, which those of you who are regular listeners of the podcast hear me talk a lot about, and also learning disabilities and supporting learners with different learning needs. So we are thrilled to have you joining us today, Tara. Thanks for being here.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here today.
Well, I love to talk about executive functioning skills related to music, which when I first heard about them a few years ago, I a lot of light bulbs went off in my head because I saw a list of executive functioning skills and I thought this is what I feel like we all say our students are struggling with when it comes to especially practicing. Because if a student's in a lesson with me, I can be a support or a scaffold for them and help them with things that aren't easy for them yet. But then there can be a lot of I don't know, difficulties following through with practice or having practice look like people wish it did. And I realized like, oh, a lot of these things are executive functioning skills, not lack of ability or not
Yeah.
caring about music skills. So that's why I'm so excited to be talking to you today. And I wondered if for people who aren't familiar, if you could just explain a bit from your perspective about executive functioning skills and what they are for people who are new to the idea.
Yeah, I want to piggyback real quick, but I will answer your question, I promise. But I want to piggyback off of something that you said, that you were seeing these needs within your realm of, music and teaching music, and you thought, I don't think this is music. I think this might be something else. That is exactly that exact question and sort of thinking like something else is going on is exactly what got me as a speech language pathologist going down this rabbit hole for the last basically 2 decades of my career. And it was as a speech language pathologist, I'm here working on speech and language development and literacy in kiddos. And I'm thinking, there's something else going on here that I am missing. And that was what set me down this very long rabbit hole. So, in short, executive function is sort of like the boss of the brain, or we could use our music example, right? Analogies, it's like a conductor. So, it's essentially like the conductor of the brain. So, it's the part of the brain that's not actually going to do the work. So, think about the workers as the instruments. The instruments are the ones that are actually going to be playing the music, actually executing the task. But the conductor isn't actually the one playing the music, but it's the part of the brain that's going to coordinate and integrate and modulate how all of the instruments work together. And what's so cool about the executive function system is that the executive function system regulates all aspects, all domains of our processing. So, for example, it's going to regulate our thoughts, it's going to regulate our perceptions, our emotions, and our actions. And so that's why when we look at like you as a music teacher, or music professional are going, wait a second, I'm seeing something else here. And me as a speech language pathologist, I'm saying, wait, I see something else here. And the classroom teacher is going, wait, I see something else here. And the parents are like, what's going on? Right? Or the counselor or the psychologist seeing the emotional needs. It impacts everything. It is this overarching system that impacts absolutely all of our processing and how we execute tasks from the time we wake up to the time we go to bed.
I think that's so helpful to think about. And for me, it's just hard to get to the music part if we're struggling with the executive function part. And so I think that's why, if I could give a message, especially to parents, because I think teachers are starting to hear more about this.
Right.
But I think if you're a parent practicing with your child at home or trying to support them to go in and get started, or not to give up in the middle or switch between tasks, all those things. I think understanding what's going on is not about my child doesn't like music or they're not cut out for music. I hear that sometimes, or, I think that piece, I'm hoping some parents listening will maybe see a bit about what could be going on below the surface.
Well, what's super interesting about the executive function system, it has a lot of components to it. So it's a really complex system when we look at it from a brain perspective. One of probably what I think is the most fascinating aspect of the whole system is what is called nonverbal working memory. It's part of our working memory system. And what this part of the brain does, this part of the executive function system does, is it allows us to foresee and pre experience a future goal. But here's what's really tricky is that the human brain can't really see that far into the future. So little kids can only see days-ish, right? Days to a week into the future. High schoolers can really only see 2 to 3 weeks into the future. And the human brain tends to peak at like 5 weeks into the future, is how far we can see. Now, becoming a master musician takes a lot longer than 5 weeks. So this is where the difficulty comes in. The difficulty comes in with kids who can't really pre-experience that end future goal of being proficient at the instrument. And that becomes really difficult. I don't like the word motivation, but that's one that's used a lot. How do you motivate yourself when you can't see the payoff, when you can't pre-experience what it would be like that far into the future? Because the goal is so far away. The goal is so far away. So, the key to that when we're really trying to, I always say we have to make an experience meaningful. And so, a goal that's potentially years away, and I have musicians. So I have two daughters that play the violin.
I love it.
I'm come from a very musical background, and it's neat because my youngest and my oldest play the violin. And so it's very neat for my sixth grader to see my 11th grader now. She has this meaningful goal of like, oh, look at my big sister play the violin. But my older daughter didn't have that. And so it was harder for her to sort of stay focused with it. Now she loves it, so, and she carves out time in her day for orchestra and practicing. But it's really hard to see that future goal when you can't quite perceive it. So we have to bring it closer to the present moment. So the payoff, if we're talking about becoming this master musician, I don't know what you call it or the terminology, but picking something that can be the real tangible goal that they can achieve today, that can feel like I've accomplished this master musician ability today, not something so far off in the future.
Mm. Yeah. Have you found, do you have a sense of how your daughter did that when she was younger?
Um, well, I'll be honest with you. I don't know so much that she did herself when she was younger. I pretty much just told her you can't quit.
Sure.
that was because I know from a professional, someone who's, specialist in the area of executive function, there's lots of research that shows how playing an instrument is actually one of the really great ways to train our executive function system for the
Mhm.
reasons I just explained, that it forces us to keep going even though we can't quite see the payoff. And that is an important developmental, cognitive developmental skill. So I've wanted all of my girls, I have three daughters. My middle one doesn't play an instrument, but she does sing and she does act and she does dance. So she does all these other things where she's got to be like working long
Mhm.
term for something bigger. But yeah, my oldest, I mean, I pretty much said, this is where you're going to be until you go to high school. She started in fifth grade. And I said, fifth through eighth grade. And then if you decide you want to do something else when you go to high school, it's fine, but you've got to play an instrument. And so, and she stuck with it. She went to high school and she's given up other things in the way of academic courses in order to keep going with the violin because now she enjoys it so much. And uh,
Mm.
I think something else, this is a total aside, but something else that's been kind of neat for my oldest is that her orchestra teacher has been the number one constant of all of her teachers. From
Sure.
she had the orchestra teacher that she has now, the high school orchestra teacher was her orchestra teacher in eighth grade. And so she's had her all these years, and that's become a really special mentor type relationship that and it's funny because I didn't even think about it. My daughter was the one who said, oh yeah, Ms. McDougal, well, she got married, but Ms. McDougal, shout out to Ms. McDougal. She has this really special relationship, my daughter does, with Ms. McDougal because she's had her for all these years.
Mm.
And she's constantly rotating through other teachers every year. And there's something that's such an
Sure.
important, especially for teenagers. Teenagers really need that kind of connection, feeling respect, and all of that from an adult. And so when you can have a constant in that way, that's not mom and dad, it's special.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think for the teachers listening, shout out to all of you who are that figure in
Yeah.
students' lives because we can have a big impact. And I did a research project with a colleague we had published in a journal, but it was about teens and motivation in music. And one of the top three motivators, one of them was the relationship I have with my music teacher. So
Yeah.
that's just exactly what you're saying. It was like fun to hear you talking about that because I know I have teachers that kept me going as a
Yeah.
musician in my life. And
Yes.
if it's just on the parents to keep their child engaged, that's not enough, especially as we get to the teen years and just developmentally we want to be our own person. So,
Yep.
but I love what you said about just saying like, oh, we're going to keep doing this. It's so good for you as a human being. And
Yeah. Time span. Right. Time span. Yeah. My youngest
mm,
also like karate. She doesn't want to do anything else. Karate, here's your time. You have to do it. And there'll be a point where you can decide, but
yeah,
we're not gonna give up at this point.
no, it's good for that part of our life where we're developing these skills and our brains developing so much, having that something that we're working at that we might not always feel like doing for the day. I have things I do like that too, but when we're younger, we
Right.
can't really see why it would be worth it to stick with it. So
That's exactly right. That's
mm,
exactly right. When they're young, they can't see that far into the future. They can't see why this is beneficial. They just don't have the life experience, right, to understand that. And that's okay. They're not supposed to. That's why they're adults who are supposed to provide the guidance, and, be their little co-pilots and directors along the path. And so, yeah, they have to learn that stick-to-itiveness, right? That's an important thing, and parents can definitely help and facilitate that.
right, exactly. All right. Well, I another topic that comes up for me a lot, and that I've talked a lot about with other music educators and parents, is the idea of sustained attention or focus. Because I didn't know much about that other than being told I wasn't doing it right if I wasn't focusing enough as a kid. But I think we don't always realize how developing that sustained attention or focus is. I wonder what you would say, especially your practice where you've worked with young people learning to read, for example, and it's probably
Mhm.
similar path to learning music skills as far as what coaching students need and learning that
Yeah.
focus. I'd love to hear what you could share with people about that.
Yeah, so a couple things. So, first off, there's a huge misconception around this idea that we sustain attention for a long time. We just simply don't. No human sustains attention for very long at all, actually. In my presentations, when I'm working with groups, I actually do a certain activity that shows them how quickly they're getting distracted. But what's really behind good, effective attention capacity is not this idea of sustaining it, but two factors. The first one is, do I have awareness around where my attention is at any given moment? So attention awareness. And the second factor is, am I able to self-direct where my attention goes? So we have to first recognize when we get distracted, and then we have to have the tools necessary to route ourselves back. And the people who master those skills and who develop those skills become people who look like they pay attention for a sustained amount of time. Because what happens is when they get distracted, they're able to route themselves back to what's important at the moment. So that's actually what attention is. And those are two things that we can help kids develop. The other thing I was thinking when you were asking the question is that it's important to understand that the executive function system is the one cognitive system in the brain that develops over an enormously long period of time. So it starts developing at birth. It probably starts before then. We just don't have the data. But we know it starts developing at birth and it continues to develop until we're in our mid to late 20s. So some of the newest research on planning is that high level planning can peak around 29. So this is a system that is going to take time to develop. And so we certainly see peaks. We see peaks when sort of we see this big growth. Again, these are all averages. I always say, like, I don't love milestones. I'm not somebody who focuses on milestones. I look at the and work with the kiddo in front of me, but I always say I've never met that 50th percentile child. Like, what? So, everybody's on their own continuum, their own developmental path. So we have these various peaks and we're going to see a lot of development in the system. But it's important to understand that a kiddo who is, let's say, 6 years old and learning to play an instrument versus a kid that's 16 is going to have a very different executive function system simply because of development, maturation, experience, practice, modeling, all of that. So we can't expect the 6-year-old to be able to sit and pay attention for an extremely long period of time or be able to direct their attention very well. And so that's it. The idea of like being able to route your attention back requires shifting. So shifting, and that's another skill that just takes time for kids to develop. First, they have to learn, oh, I have this focused attention ability, because that's a kind of attention that we're not born with. We're not born with this attention that is like laser. We talk about as the flashlight attention. We're not born with that. It's something that has to be developed. And then we have to learn how to maneuver that flashlight. We have to learn how to shift it. And that takes time. So we have to just be very realistic in terms of what we expect.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's really helpful to think about. I don't think it's often my own music teacher training, not something that's talked about a lot. So it helps some light bulbs go on for me.
Yeah, and there are so many things that we can do to support that development. I think the easiest and my favorite is what I call reflexive questioning. So when we see a kiddo get distracted, we can just ask a few little questions, say, oh, where are your thoughts right now? Or where's your flashlight? Where's your attention flashlight shining right now? Where should we be shining that attention flashlight? You're right, it should be on our music. Can you show me that? Can you shine your attention flashlight on what we're doing right now? And what we've done is we've modeled and given them the tools to route themselves back. Instead of yelling, pay attention, right? But we're just getting curious and we're helping them redirect back.
And what I've heard you say from classes I've taken with you and so on is that how we do that. And like you just use the most pleasant tone of voice. And I think doing it in even neutral, we could think about tone of voice because it's easy to feel like I've just told them 20 times in this half
Yeah.
hour, practice session to bring their attention back. And it's easy to feel frustrated by that. I think I see that sometimes
Yes.
where I students get told focus, but it starts to sound more and more urgent.
Yeah, and that's such a good point. We want to get curious. So that's the key. The key isn't that we don't want to be punitive and coming off as harsh. we're just getting curious about where their thoughts are. Where's your flashlight shining right now? Right? We're just getting curious because we're wanting the kiddo to get curious. We're wanting them to start having some awareness around what's happening in their mind, what's happening with their attention. And we can do that by getting curious with them. And it is way more, like you said, pleasant than nagging. Pay attention, pay attention, pay attention, pay attention. And before, if you use that reflexive questioning a lot, what you'll see in not too long is that pretty soon they'll be like, Miss Sumter, where is your flashlight shining? And I'll be like, whoops, sorry.
I love it.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I think that's really helpful to think about. And I think we can be more curious if we understand what's going on and don't see it as misbehavior. Um,
That's a really good point. Kiddos with executive function needs very often are labeled or identified or seen through the lens of behavior, especially the kids who tend to struggle with attention and also another executive function skill called inhibition. So, inhibition is that ability to restrain ourselves, to delay gratification, to sort of rein ourselves in. And kiddos who struggle with that development, they look very impulsive. They're acting, now, constantly now, and not really thinking about, or not that they don't think about it, they understand future consequences, but they're not processing it and stopping in the moment as a result of that future consequence. So those kiddos are often very much misunderstood. And behavior modification plans are put into place and yada yada. And it's not effective, or they're punished, right? So we might see a change, a lot of times. Sometimes we can see a change in behavior out of the punishment, but then it's because not because they learn the skill, but because fear based, they don't want the punishment involved. So it doesn't actually teach them what it is that needs to be done differently.
Sure. And the method I use the Suzuki method a lot of times for very young kids, a parent is practicing with the child because they're being asked to do things that are complicated for them to do alone. And then eventually, though, the goal is, of course, that the student's going to practice independently. And so I do think if we're the parent practicing with our child, it can feel like, oh, this takes time to talk about refocusing and we're not going down the list. But I think if we think bigger picture, your child's actually hopefully learning these skills with your coaching. And then eventually they're going to be able to handle this on their own so much better. So
Yeah.
we're building that skill. That's not just a violin skill or a piano skill or a cello skill, but like using our brains. It's kind of a skill.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And I mean, what an incredible way to use music, right? To use music to develop executive function skills. And again, how do we learn anything? How do we develop anything? We learn it by modeling, right? By watching the models and then by practicing and then by getting constructive feedback. And so since executive function, that whole system is needed for everything that we do, we can take any activity, plop it in and practice that. Oh, where are our thoughts? Where should they be? Or maybe it's what's our plan for our session today? What do we see ourselves doing first? Right? Using that kind of structure in order to facilitate the session. But at the same time, we're modeling and we're practicing what good executive function looks like.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the payoff for that might feel like it takes a while to see, but I think it really does pay off. I've shared before on the podcast for listeners, but I was diagnosed in my 20s with ADHD. And the doctor who diagnosed me said he did think I was presented as successful in a school situation because I had learned through my music lessons how to, you know, of course it was stressful to pull it all together without the skills
Yeah.
being practiced, but I had learned some skills just through the experience of learning music and it did really help me. Yeah, not to say everything was easy or perfect, but
Yeah.
it was an advantage to me to have had some place to practice those skills for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah, that does bring up an interesting point. It's taken a long time for the research world to start understanding and being able to identify what ADHD looks like in women and girls. It does present very differently. Girls and women tend to internalize more than externalize. And so, obviously, when needs and issues are being internalized, it becomes much harder to identify from the outside. So that's why boys tend to get identified a lot more because they tend to, not always, but tend to externalize more. So you see the movement and the excitability and the distraction and all that. And girls, it tends to be much more internal. So I think I think we're starting to be able to understand that a little bit better, but I think a lot of people our age were missed
Yeah.
as a result of that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Exactly. We have a little more time. I'd love to ask you about a couple other things. One executive function skill that I feel like I know less about, but I'm becoming more aware of as I go down the rabbit hole, as you said earlier, is just the idea of perception and how that can impact our learning.
Mm.
And so I'd love if you could share, anything you think would be helpful to know for those working with music students, whether it's their kids or their students, about how perception impacts all of this.
Yeah. Okay. So that's a great question. I'm gonna back up a little bit on this topic.
Yeah.
So, I talked about how executive function is this really large system of skills. And I have broken these skills down into what I refer to as the roots, the leaves, and the flowers. And I mean, most adults, when they think about executive function skills, and when kids are identified with executive function needs, they're typically identifying flower skills, which would be things like prioritizing, organizing, planning, time sense, pacing. Some of these higher level types of skills are the ones that get focused on. And those are the ones when you look on social media, that's what everyone's talking about, right? So, but the problem is that these skills develop if we have a strong root system. And so the root system of the executive function system it is established by perception, attention, working memory, and inhibition. So those four skills form this root system. And perception is the most fundamental of all of those. So what perception is perception is the awareness of our environment, and it's the awareness of ourselves. And this is kind of layered. But when we think about perception of our environment, this is our ability to be aware of the people that are in the world around us, the objects that are around us. How tuned in are we? How much are we noticing of not just the macro aspects of what's happening in our world, like what people are saying, but like the micro aspects, which is how they're saying it, right? What was the intonation? What was the facial expression? What was the body movements? So our perception of our environment ends up wiring how we learn. And because of this, we could fall down a whole nother rabbit hole. We don't have time for that. But we could talk about sensory integration, sensory processing, sensory preferences. Those very much tie into how someone perceives that perception of their environment. We're going to perceive the world based on our sensory preferences. So if there are certain sounds, colors, whatever, movements that we prefer, that's what we're going to gravitate towards. That's how we're going to connect to the world. And then other things we'll avoid, right? We'll avoid other types of sensory input because those don't feel good to our system. And so then I don't get that input. I don't learn that, or I don't learn that way. So, but what's important to understand is that how we perceive the world is how we learn everything. Because everything, for the most part, nearly everything that we're going to learn is something that the world has created for us. Whether it's a speech system, whether it's a language system, whether it's a math system, whether it's a music system, whatever the symbol system is that the human has created, right? We have to learn it from the environment. So if we're not aware, right? If we're kind of in our own world and we're not tuned into what's happening outside of us, we're missing an enormous amount of modeling, an enormous amount of learning. The other aspect is perception of ourself. So we have to be able to tune into what is it that I'm feeling in my body. That's what we call interoception. So what do I feel inside my body? What are the cues that I'm getting? Is my heart racing? Am I hurting in my head? Do I feel tight in my chest? Whatever that is. And then we have to have awareness around our thoughts. So what does this mean? If I'm feeling tightness in my chest, what does this mean? What is the thought that I have around that? And then that becomes perception of our actions is kind of what's that born into. So, then we have to be aware of how is it that we're acting within the world around us. So this whole system of perceiving the world is how we're going to learn. And then perception of self is how we're going to learn to self-regulate and how we're going to learn how to adjust. So it's kind of this dance between the two.
Mm, yeah, that's a lot to think
Mhm.
about, I think, as you know, I mean, I've thought about it some and still I'm like, I can feel my brain like working through it. I think sometimes when I'm teaching a student or working with a student, I feel like there's maybe it is just that they're really in their own thoughts or their own heads or, inner world so much that we're trying to do a task on the instrument, but I can't really get them to engage with it, that kind of thing. And I wonder, what do you do? What do you suggest to people who are working with students to help a student if they can, to
Yeah.
kind of, we're trying to get them to perceive something we're interested in, and maybe they're thinking about something else.
Exactly. So there's a couple things you can do. You can take it from the angle of attention if you want to do that. And we can talk about that attention flashlight. And it's important to understand that with that attention flashlight, unfortunately, our brain only gets one, and we can shine it externally or we can shine it internally. So we have to learn how to shift between the two. So we have to teach kids that. We have to teach that they have this attention flashlight and that they can shift it on different things. So if you see that a kiddo might be shining their flashlight internally on their thoughts or something else, then we can say, oh, where's your flashlight shining right now? Where should our flashlight be shining? Can you shine it on what it is that we're doing right now? Another thing that you can do, so that would be kind of taking it from the attention angle. Taking it more from the perception angle, specifically, what I would probably do there is I would, instead of focusing on necessarily the playing right away, I would focus on a sensory experience with whatever the instrument is that you're working on. So you're pulling their perception out into the world with this object. And then try to layer on top of that the teaching, whatever it is that you're going to do. But it might be just simply starting off with having some sort of sensory experience with the instrument. So, what am I picturing for that? I'm picturing, maybe if it's the violin, I'm going to rub the top of the violin and we're going to talk about what that feels like. That feels so smooth. What if I rub the strings? What does that feel like? And we're orienting their sense organs to what it is that you're going to try to then facilitate musically. You're going to try to apply something to that. So we want to think about what are all of the senses that we can use. We've got our five, but there's actually three more, right? So we've got our vestibular system, which is our balance and spinny system. We have our proprioceptive system, which is force and just how um, um, the pressure that we feel. You can talk about proprioception in the context of, squeezing something and pushing on something. Does it squeeze? Is it hard? What's that force like? And then our interoception, which we talked about, those internal cues. So these eight senses, we can use all of these in having an experience with the instrument, and that's going to pull their perception to the object before you try to apply something a little bit higher level. So that would be something I could be fun to try.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. It's making me think sometimes when I'm having trouble with my own practice and I feel just really like I can't get myself to focus in, I will stand on a balance board or something like that and try to play. Do you think that's getting into that proprioception, or how would you, interoception? What would you think is going on there? I'm very curious.
Yeah, the balance board's really gonna, yeah, vestibular, that balance. Yep, absolutely. I mean, again, this goes back to
Right.
whatever our sensory preferences are, right? Whatever it is that someone really likes, what fuels them, what regulates their system, those are the senses that we want to pull in. And that's different for everybody. The people who predominantly study that are occupational therapists who specialize in sensory integration, but it's a fascinating topic. It's one I've spent, gosh, a long time studying because it's such a key part of the executive function system. But yeah, I mean it's really important to pull that in. And we think about music as being so auditory, but there's so much else going on, right? Like if it's a violin, well, I definitely have sensory input that I'm getting through my arm. It's probably pretty sore, my arm's getting tired. There are all these different senses. So I would think about how many sensory cues can you tap into for that kiddo with the
Mhm.
experience other than just listening, right? Other than just pulling it, because auditory might not actually be someone's sensory preference.
Right.
And that might be counterintuitive. Then why would they play a musical instrument? Well, there could be so many other things that we're getting from the musical instrument other than the auditory feedback, that sound. Even if we just think about bone conduction and how, right, the sound bounces around in our skull and our body and all those things, that provides some kind of feedback that can feel good. Um, so yeah, I would kind of take it from that angle. I was thinking about, kids who struggle with that auditory input. It would be interesting to see if there were kids who had difficulty that the auditory wasn't a preference, if they were really resistant to playing certain instruments. And it could even be so sometimes auditorily we have a preference for certain frequencies. So a kiddo who might have a really hard time processing high frequencies, they might be better on a cello than on a
Yeah,
violin. I mean, all those things to consider, right? Doesn't mean they shouldn't
exactly.
play. It just means that there might be another reason. I played the flute when I was growing up, and the sound of the trumpet in the band just used to hurt my ears so bad. And I remember thinking, like, how can these kids play the trumpet? I don't understand how they can do this. That sound just felt like a pick going through my head. So understanding that everyone's going to process all of that so differently changes, the recommendations that we would make for musical instruments, different things to try with different kids.
Yeah,
Gosh, I could talk about this for a while.
it's fascinating. I've definitely switched some students from violin to viola. I teach both when the if the E string's really bothering them. Sometimes it is. I can tell the high pitch.
That's so smart.
Yeah, why torture yourself if you feel like it's a horrible sound?
Yeah, and I feel like so many teachers, music teachers might not pick up on that. Like they wouldn't quite understand what's going on. That's brilliant.
Well, yeah, it's so interesting and it's so personal. And I think I wished my own how I worked had been considered more as a kid. People just didn't know even girls could have ADHD
Yeah.
when I was younger. I didn't think they could. So I get that it's not anybody's fault, but I do think I'm really interested in all this because I think like, oh, I needed this as a kid, and I can see, between my own kids and kids I work
Mhm.
with, I feel like music is so good for everyone. How do we make it work for kids who just need a different approach or need just more insight into what's going on with them that's getting in the way?
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, music can be such a great facilitator of just so much learning. But again, I mean, obviously you're a music teacher, but again, we go back to like what is it that someone needs, right? If someone is needing, say, proprioception and they're needing a lot of proprioceptive input, well, I want that kid doing a certain kind of sports
Right.
where they need a lot of proprioception, right? Where they're getting a lot of input into their body. And there are a lot of, swimming is one there's just, so many different ways. But again, it goes back to what is it that they need. And sometimes different activities are going to provide that different kind of sensory input.
Sure.
But yeah, music does so much for the brain. But we
Right.
know that. Yeah.
Yes.
There's so much.
And I'm not anti-sports at all. I think too, like if you can play a sport and play an instrument, I think those are great for us all in
Yeah.
different ways.
They're,
So
yeah, they're great compliments. That's for sure.
yeah. Well, if I could ask you one more thing before we go,
Absolutely.
the one of the other topics that I hear a lot about, and have a number of students with ADHD in my
Mm.
studio. So I hear this from their parents, especially when they're teens and maybe they want to play their instrument, they love their instrument, but then they have a really hard time getting started with practice. And I know this for myself as an adult who love, like, for example, this podcast I love doing when it's time to sit down and edit audio or do something that feels like, oh, this is going to take a lot of deep focus and it's going to tax my brain. I know I also have trouble getting started. So it's not just a kid thing. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what's going on when we have that task initiation or task switching or however you want to, whatever angle you could share with us that might explain what we see is going on.
Yeah, that's another really good question. So, really, what we have to think about here is that when we have to start a task, there are a couple key factors, but one of the most important, especially when you see someone having trouble getting started, is are they having to switch from something preferred to something non-preferred? And that is where we need a lot more executive function ability to switch from something preferred to something non-preferred. And at any given moment, what we consider preferred or non-preferred is going to feel different. So if for some reason the practice doesn't feel preferred, right? If it feels like a non-preferred task, we're going to have a much harder time regulating to it, meaning initiating it, starting it. So in that case, what we have to do is we have to figure out how to plan out the task itself in a way that it feels manageable. And really, that starts with the very first step. So let's say we have our whole plan of what it is that we have to practice. And if we're still having trouble initiating, getting started, then we have to look at the first step. So that's where we have to focus. And we have to, I ask my students when I work, especially my high school and college kids, especially college, they go off and they're by themselves and oh my gosh, life falls apart, right? Because they haven't had mom who's been in their executive function system forever. Now they're having to do it themselves. So we dissect that first step and I'll say, does that first step actually feel manageable? And does it feel likable? And again, we obviously have to be able to do things that we don't like. That's part of life. But if we can figure out a way to make it a little bit more enjoyable, then we're going to have more success. So sometimes it's as simple as I only have to practice for 2 minutes and then I can take a break. Or maybe I only, whatever feels manageable. So I'll ask my students, I'll say, you tell me how much time practicing feels like a good amount. What feels good in your body to you, like something that you can do. Instead of me saying, okay, you're going to do this for 30 minutes and then you're going to, right? I'm going to say, what feels manageable to you? And then that's where we're going to start. And then the next week I might say, and this is fun to track with kids, so I'll make like a chart. We practiced for, 3 minutes last week. Yay. And then the following week, I'll say, okay, we did such a great job with 3 minutes last week. What do you think? Do you think you can do four? And make it like a challenge. Do you think you can do it? How would you do it? How would you get yourself to do 4 minutes? And you're just slowly going to scaffold over time. So that's one way to do it. But also it can be taking the whole, if you have a longer practice, length, breaking it down. That very first step is the one that has to be focused on. And then asking that question of, does this feel manageable to you? And then really pre-experience it. So take the time to help them put themselves into the future, time travel into the future and say, okay, let's pretend like we're going to practice. Where do you see yourself? What do you hear around you? Do you smell anything? Again, we're pulling all that sensory information. Do you smell anything around you? Do you see anything around that might be distracting, that might sort of get in our way? So what do we need to plan for? What are those disruptors that we kind of need to plan for?
Mm.
And take it from that angle.
Yeah, I like that sensory angle a lot. I think too, sometimes we say get started and it sounds like I'll find myself doing this with any task I'm doing too, where it sounds like one thing, but inside of that one thing is really drop down menu of 10 little things. And then
Yes.
actually my brain's overwhelmed, even if it seems silly that it should be overwhelmed because it's just so many little parts to this thing that I'm calling one thing. So I was like, oh, it's just getting
Yeah.
started. What's so hard? But it might be like stopping what you're doing, mentally shifting, opening your case, tuning the instrument, whatever. Like
Mhm.
there's a lot of steps that we're calling one step um,
Yeah.
that I think can get overwhelming sometimes too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the other factor too to consider is this idea of what has become automatic. So automaticity is something that the brain has to develop and acquire for tasks in order to offload working memory so that working memory can practice what needs to be learned.
Mm,
So working memory is going to juggle and practice and figure out what to do with this information that's coming in. We'll say practicing to get better at whatever the skill is. So we have to think about these other tasks, like you said, opening the case, getting the instrument ready. Do we have to put resin on our bow? Like, what is it that we have to do? And if that hasn't become automatic yet, that's going to take executive function capacity to do that. We're going to have less for the actual practice time.
mm,
So thinking of it in those terms, how much can we automate? We talk about this in the context of reading and in the context of math, right? Like math facts are important because they become the automaticity that offloads working memory so that we can do the word problem. when we haven't when we haven't made math facts automatic, working memory is having to juggle all of it, and then the working memory poops out, right? I could give you loads of
Yep.
examples of how this works in the brain. But for in the terms of music, right, I would imagine there are a lot of things that we need to focus on trying to make automatic
Mm.
so that working memory can offload it so that the task itself doesn't feel so heavy. So that then what we're over here juggling with working memory to actually learn is smaller. So it doesn't feel quite as big.
Oh, I love that. I think that's very helpful to
Okay.
think about. Yeah, I definitely do. I think, if we are a parent listening, trying to help your child get started with practice, and it always seems like, oh, this is the hardest part, that thinking about how could we automate this
Mhm.
could be really, really helpful.
Yeah, through practice. Automaticity is going to come through repetition, right? Repetition, repetition, repetition. And so, if I were a music teacher and there was something that I wanted to automate, that's where my focus would be for a while. And then once we've automated that, then I'm going to move over to application or something else involved. Or maybe most of the practice focus will be on automating whatever I needs to be right there at their fingertips, literally. And then the other aspect, whatever the practice itself is going to be smaller. And then we're going to just kind of do a teeter-totter. We're going to shift. People can't see what I'm doing with my hands. I talk with my hands. This is the problem on podcasts. Okay. Christine's over here like her hands are flailing everywhere. So but we're going to decrease, right? As automaticity improves, that becomes less of a weight for our working memory system. And then we can increase how much then the working memory is being applied to the actual learning of the music itself.
No, I love that. I think if you're a music teacher listening, you could just, or especially a strings teacher, I'm thinking when we first learn to make a bow hold, it's just like this finger goes here. Then you spend so much time. You might write out the steps and look at the steps every day for like months and months. But eventually, it's just pick up the bow and make the bow hold, and it's
Yeah.
become automatic, and then you can go on and work on other things. So even writing out the steps of getting started, right? And then just you might have to feel like, oh, we're doing this so many times talking about this, but eventually, hopefully, or they just always have their list and they go through their list.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Well, and it's important to remember too that when we talk about automating certain tasks, every single individual is going to need a different amount of repetitions to reach that level of automaticity.
sure.
So some kids might need 4 repetitions and they have it mastered. Some will need 40 and some will need 40,000. So I always say one of my favorite quotes I say all the time is that a child's success is dependent upon our willingness to not give up. Like
Mm,
we have to just keep going because some kids need a lot more repetition, and that's okay. That's absolutely okay. So we need to be mindful of everyone's speed is going to be a little bit different because everyone's going to need a different number of repetitions, and that amount of repetition is going to be different per skill that we're trying to learn, right? Some kids might nail math facts really quickly, but then need a lot more time becoming automatic with playing the violin or whatever that looks like. So just because they're good in one area and can automate quickly doesn't mean that in other areas they'll be able to automate quickly. So yeah, important to keep that in mind. There's no magic number of repetitions that a brain needs. It's highly variable based on person to person, and we just keep going until. That's what I always
right.
tell my students. We go until, we practice until. Yes.
I think that's important because it doesn't mean it's not worth doing the thing, or
Right.
it just means,
Yeah.
yeah, extra repetitions. Yeah, I love that. I think that's a wonderful note to leave people with today. Thank you so much for your time. Could you share where people could find you and more about your work if they are interested in connecting with what you do after this conversation?
Sure. Yes. So I post regularly on Instagram, just sharing information on executive function and its application to child development and child learning. And you can find me at Tera Sumpter underscore SLP. I'm also on Facebook, Seeds of Learning LLC. That's my company. And then terasumpter.com. So those are the best places to find me.
Yeah, and I think if this connected with you at all as a parent or a teacher, I found some great resources there. I'm always learning new things from what you post and from being a part of
Oh,
your
good.
your online membership. And you've got a lot of great resources for people. So I hope people will go check that out. And thank you so much for your time and for sharing all this with us. Super helpful.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a real pleasure.
Before we go today, here are a few of my takeaways from this conversation with Tara Sumpter. First of all, I loved the idea of using sensory input to help connect a student, maybe ourselves, to what we are doing on the outside, if we might be really focused internally, and to help bring our attention to the practice or the music task that we were trying to work on in the practice space or in lessons. I really liked that idea of how we have this flashlight attention, the kind of attention that you can focus in on one thing at a time. uh, that's something I've learned and thought a lot about, but I was really happy to be reminded about the fact that we can only shine it one place at a time. And if it's really shown directly internally, then we are not shining it externally on the thing we're doing in our music practice or in our lesson. And that can be part of what's going on. So I loved those reminders. I think it's something to dig more into if you want more information about what all of that means. If that feels like a lot to take in, definitely visit Tara Sumpter's website and follow her on Instagram if you are there. There's a lot of great information she shares. And she is also starting a new cohort of people to work through her course on executive function skills in January. I'm joining that myself. So there's a lot of ways to learn more about this. But I do think pulling our attention or shining that flashlight attention on what we are currently doing outside of ourselves, if we're really internally focused, is something I'm going to take away from this conversation. The second takeaway for me is the idea of reflexive questioning, or asking with curiosity our child or our student, where's your flashlight or where's your attention right now? And helping them think about it and redirect their attention where it needs to go. I love that Tara reminded us it's not really our goal to have this sustained attention that never wavers, because that's not how attention works. But really, how it works is to be aware of where our attention is and then to be able to shift our attention to the task at hand. People who can do those things look like they can focus extremely well. And so we are helping our child practice how to do that, often when we are helping them shift their attention, or even just asking that reflexive questioning question, where is your flashlight attention right now? And helping them become aware in the moment. I will say, I know that takes a lot of patience to practice day in and day out when we're in the practice space with our child, but that's really important work to help them develop those skills. And then, final takeaway I'll share with you for now is just remembering how great music is for helping us practice and build executive function skills. I loved hearing Tara share that she wanted her own children involved in music and learning an instrument, because she knew how helpful music and learning an instrument specifically can be for developing these executive function skills. I thought that was a fantastic reminder of all the things that we build in music, even beyond the skills that we're building on our instrument itself. I will include links to connect with Tara and her resources in the show notes and in the blog post for this episode, suzukitriangle.com/episode 112. I'd love to hear how this episode connected with you, what you took away, what it's helping you think about or understand. You can email me, Christine@suzukitriangle.com, or find me on Instagram @SuzukiTriangle is my handle there. What a privilege to kick off the year hearing from someone so passionate about helping students learn. I really know I'm feeling inspired all over again as I got this episode ready to share with you today. I hope one of these ideas connected with you or can help you understand what's going on as you're practicing or teaching this week. Wishing you a wonderful week of practice ahead. Take good care, everyone.